Please. It is lovely to be here again today, and it is nice to see a few new faces. Crime is an awful thing. For those of us who have ever been a victim of a crime, it is awful. It disempowers us, it hurts us, it degrades us. It attacks our very humanity. I remember sitting with my mother, who was living by herself in Stokes Valley when me and Jenny were living in Wellington. And I remember sitting with her after her house had been burgled. And I remembered watching a relatively confident mother turn into a fearful wreck, with the thought that once again her home may be burgled. We are here today, and the Anglican Church is focusing this week on penal reform for this very reason. Because we want to live in a nation where crime is diminishing, where people do not have to live in fear. In October last year, the House of Bishops met. I think it was Archbishop Philip who said, we need to do some work around penal reform. Straight away, all the bishops agreed at that meeting. We all could tell stories from the grassroots, from right around this country, of how we can do better in relation to penal reform. 15 months ago, I was here and you installed me as the Bishop of Wellington. On that day, I carried a wooden crozier carved by the inmates of Rimutaka prison. They had given it to me during that week, saying, "You must take this and never forget us." Today and this week, I acknowledge that commitment. In order to reduce crime in our country and support victims, we must reform our penal system. This week, we are focusing on 6 different issues that we think will make a difference, that we think will support victims. The first is addressing the causes of crime. Everybody who commits a crime has a story. That is normally a story that involves mental health or addiction issues. Nobody just commits a crime in a vacuum. There is always a backstory. We want to focus on, are we producing a penal system which is based around punishment and retribution, or is it actually based around restoration and changing lives so criminals will no longer reoffend? At the moment, we know that our jails are in fact training schools for crime where you come out with a greater chance of reoffending than when you went in. We do the victims of crime a disservice by allowing this punishment-based system to continue, as opposed to working out how we actually change and restore lives so this will never happen again. We are going to focus on the alternatives to punishment because there are many well-researched alternatives which this present government is supporting. The challenge is the people of New Zealand and the Anglican Church needs to get in behind it. We need to put our weight on the alternatives that have been proven to work and have been proven to reduce reoffending. We're going to focus this week on the treatment of prisoners. Those who are incarcerated with mental health issues or with addiction issues, these issues are hardly ever addressed while they are incarcerated. It is great that this morning we have the choristers with us, because we will focus on the children of prisoners this week. There are 20,000 children who are doing time for a crime they didn't commit. 20,000 children spread around New Zealand, just like our choristers, whose one of their parents is incarcerated, but they pay the price. We know that these children, when they grow up, have a 7 times chance of themselves being incarcerated. If we as the Anglican Church can do something about this, that's a lot of victims that can be saved the pain of these children offending later in life. We are present in these communities where these children reside. What will we do? The final focus of this week is prisoner reintegration. Research says that prisoners need to come out of jail and be reintegrated into our communities. Instead, they come out with a sign over their head that says stigma, that says criminal. They've done their time, but they've never done their time. We know that employment is a key to breaking cycles of offending. And so when prisoners come out, if we want to support the victims and the future victims in this country, we need to work better at reintegrating prisoners. And the church has a solid role in this. Why is it important that we get involved in penal reform? I want to offer 4 reasons. The first reason is this. Today we remember Elizabeth Fry. Elizabeth Fry gave her life in order to turn around the prison system of her time, in order to make sure that prisoners actually were educated and actually had opportunity of employment. Right through history, Christians have consistently stood for the sake of compassion and justice. Now, many times we're not known for that, and many times we have dropped the ball. But wouldn't it be great if we did better on this? If we followed the historical precedents of people like Elizabeth Fry and others who lived lives of compassion and made a difference. So often we fall so short of the mark. We spend our lives in communities based around fear as opposed to communities based around hope. So due to the historical precedent, I invite you to join the large cloud of witnesses as spoken about in Hebrews 12:1. As we join with that large cloud of witnesses, we too will live lives of inclusion, of justice and compassion. The second reason I would say why it's imperative that we become involved in penal reform as a church is this. It's biblical. We've heard from the Genesis passage today, the passage of Joseph imprisoned. Many people don't know this, but if you actually go through the Bible, you will see that the Bible consistently has nothing good to say about prisons. Actually, the alternative is true. The Bible is constantly talking about reconciling prisoners and liberating prisoners. The Matthew 25 passage, our eternal salvation will depend on whether we visit prisoners in jail and reintegrate them into our society. I remember I was at St Andrews in the Reikorangi Valley, our little church in the valley there, and I was preaching on Jesus' mandate, Luke 4, where he preaches, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me," as he preaches from Isaiah. And then I got to the verse that says, he's come to release the captives, release the prisoners. Now, I wasn't bold enough to actually say what I thought, so instead I just said, imagine if Jesus actually meant this. Imagine if Jesus actually meant when he stood up in the synagogue and said, "I've come to release captives, prisoners." It was very interesting, and I think many of us feel this way. At the end of the service, it's never happened to me before, it may happen to me today. At the end of the service, one of the congregation stood up and said, Justin, you can't be serious about that, can you? I mean, people are in jail for reasons. And I took the only route I knew how, and I said, I'm just the messenger. Biblically, it is clear that God has a concern for the well-being of prisoners because he wants to see less reoffending and communities reconciled where people do not have to live in fear. The third reason why I think we should be involved is this. It is just common sense. Anybody who has done any reading on the issue and done any research on this will find that it's actually just common sense. That if we want to support victims better and make our communities communities of hope and not fear, then it's common sense. The majority of people in prison are people who can't read or write. They have mental health problems. They have alcohol and drug problems. They have learning difficulties. They are isolated from their families, and then they are taken away from what they have left. They are vulnerable. They have few or no qualifications. They have limited work experience. They have lack of work and social skills. Often they've been excluded from school. Often they've been looked after by the state as a child. Here's what I think is the most damning statistic of all. 4 out of 10 Māori males will spend some time in prison in their life. 4 out of 10. Something has gone seriously wrong. Over the last 30 years, per 100,000 people, we've doubled the amount we incarcerate. At the same time, over the last 20 years, our society's got safer and safer. But we still live under this illusion of fear. It costs close to $100,000 a year to incarcerate somebody. It only costs $2,000 a year for them to do community work, or $25,000 for them to be on home detention. Or to set up a support network of rehabilitation probably only costs just over $10,000 a year. Bill English in 2011 made the statement that prisons are a moral and a fiscal failure. The research is done. We know that what we have at the moment isn't working. We can do better. The final reason I would say why we need to become involved is this. As you know, for many years, me and Jenny have spent our time with vulnerable people. We spent a lot of time fostering teenage young women, over 40 teenage young women in the time, and many of them came from backgrounds where they were victims. And over the years, we've lived in the inner city of Cuba Street and hung out with the street community and addicts and mental health consumers and petty criminals, etc. I want to tell you what I've learned over the years is that these are just people. They're not numbers, they're people. There are 8,500 people, and then there are their victims locked up in fear as well, but they are people. Last week, me and Jenny were in Sydney, and while we were in Sydney, we were speaking at this gathering, and I was speaking on a topic and about God's care for the vulnerable and the marginalised, etc. And we arrived at Central Station in Sydney, and while we were there waiting for our lift, we were outside in the sun, and I had my head full of my dynamic, powerful talk that I was soon to deliver. Jenny, on the other hand, had her head in the right place. We're sitting outside, and Jenny notices this waif and stray of a woman, and Jenny goes up and says hello, and she's sitting on the steps. And she's sitting on the steps of the station. She's just come in from Melbourne. She knows nobody in Sydney. She's as thin as a rake. She's got a water bottle full of vodka, I think it was. She'd been chucked off a train. She couldn't go where she wanted to go anymore. She knew nobody. And Jenny just goes up and says hello. And then Jenny comes and sits down next to me on the step, and she says to this woman, "Oh, do you want to come and sit with us?" And this woman says, "Oh yes, please, I'm so lonely." We had to put a jacket down for her to sit on because she was so thin, it would have been too painful on her bones to sit down just straight. As we're sitting there and Jenny's talking to this woman and hearing her story, she's just a person. I don't know if she's a victim or she's a perpetrator. She's probably both. And as Jenny's sitting down talking to her, I, of course, have my head in this powerful talk I'm going to do. And I'm thinking, "Jenny, why are you doing this? Can't you see I've got to focus?" So I'm trying to look for an escape. So I go to the escape that most of us go to. I pull out my cell phone and check my emails. You know what I mean? I don't have to deal with reality. I can deal with cyberspace instead. And as I pull out my email that's just come in, who is it from? But another friend of mine who hasn't been in contact in a few months and has been in jail on and off for 20 years and has now been out for 3 years and is making contact. It's kind of like God said, "You can't escape. This is a person. You need to be present. This is not about numbers. This is about people in our community who matter and care." And that's why we need to do this. We need to be about penal reform because it's about everyday people and it's about our neighbours. And we, as the Anglican Church, we have an amazing opportunity. We are present in so many geographical neighbourhoods right across this country, right across our diocese. And in every one of those places, there are families and there are individuals who we can make a difference in. Whether they are victims or those incarcerated and their families, we can support them and move towards a society not governed by fear, but a society where our crime rates drop, where there are less victims, and a society governed by a story of hope. Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, you bring good tidings to the afflicted, bind up the broken-hearted, and proclaim liberty to the captives. We thank you for sending Elizabeth Fry into the prisons with words of comfort and deeds of care. Grant that all who minister to those in prison may be filled with your compassion and be bearers of your hope through Jesus Christ, our Redeemer. Blessed are you, Jesus, our good shepherd, and Elizabeth, your minister. Year after year she visited women in prisons and asylums. May we too understand and care for people unconditionally. Amen.